So good afternoon to everybody, and Quinn, thank you for doing this today. Look, it seems very relevant to talk about where we're coming out of the pandemic, and from a marketer's point of view, over a year ago, many marketers made assumptions in terms of what they needed to do during this COVID period. I was wondering if you could maybe walk us back from your perspective and tell us about some of the things that you thought were going to happen. Did they happen? And some of the initiatives that you put in place, and how did they turn out?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think as we went into the pandemic, we were, I think, especially conservative in how we approached it. I think we assumed the worst from a business perspective, and so cut back almost 100% on marketing investment, at least in my world, which is really the overall corporate marketing and marketing the brand. And so we cut back to almost zero and really focused on things that we could control for very low or no cost. So training our people much more effectively on the brand, insourcing a lot of the capabilities like strategy, creative, production, to be able to continue to generate work out there without incurring cost. Our owned media channels, so we completely cut off paid and went to owned. And then from a measurement perspective, we focused really heavily on reputation. So we wanted to really measure not as much the funnel metrics we traditionally do, but really look at how are people talking about the tech industry, how are people talking about Lenovo and our competitors. And so we kind of went very, very conservative, kind of batten the hatches down in preparation for having a really tough year as a business. And I think we learned a ton, from the process of doing that. How, it's amazing how quickly you can turn everything off. And the kind of the change management process of bringing the team along with us, keeping the morale high and still continuing to put out work, but also have obviously learned a lot over the last 12 months.
It's interesting you talked about stopping the paid media, which I think many advertisers did. Two questions around that. Did any of that concern you? Because I think marketers, sometimes it's always a bit of a argument and case that you need to make to actually get the budgets that you have. Mm-hmm. So did you have any concerns when things went off? And then second, how impressed or surprised were with you regarding the flexibility of commitments? Did anything there surprise you?
I was massively worried about it. I mean, I think money is our lifeline, and we've always gone and argued for money, or requested money, and sometimes argued for it, and generally we're successful. And so I had a steady stream of money out there. And one of the arguments we always made is, if you stop spending, your core brand metrics will drop. So we'd always use the term, coin activated. So you got to keep spending in order to keep building that brand. But we'd never tested that theory, never wanted to. We always had money to spend on it. So this tested that theory. So yeah, I went in on one hand, worried as a marketer, saying, all right, I know when we turn this off, our brand metrics are going to drop. I went in on the other hand, just as someone who had been making this argument for 8 years, going, well, what if they don't drop? Like, there goes my funding source and my argument in the future. So I was worried on multiple fronts as I went in, definitely. And then, I think it's hard to think back to that time because we've been through so much since then. But I mean, the flexibility from our partners, the media properties, the agencies that we use to plan and buy our media was pretty amazing. I think everyone was just in a fog. No one knew what was coming. Everyone was at various stages of panic, both obviously personally, but also, professionally. And, people did the right thing consistently. I mean, we tried to be, moving at speed, but fair. And, so there was a huge sense of urgency on our side to shut everything off. And we tried to be realistic about how to do that. So, but I found everyone we worked with, every one of our partners, came at it with really good intentions, not always able to move as quickly as we wanted them to, but you saw them they were pulling out the stops, doing really, unnatural effort to try to get it done.
And then as you went through the lessons on the pandemic at the beginning, at what point did you feel it had moved from being just hey, a short term, we need to get through this, let's put a few things in place and let's just ride it out, to it's now a new way of working. It's now the way that we are sustaining our marketing efforts. When did that really
Yeah.
occur?
Well, we had an interesting view on it because we're a company with a huge presence in China, and so had a line of sight into the pandemic and the potential impact somewhat earlier than a lot of businesses did, because we had, I have a large team in Beijing, and just from talking to them personally, they were experiencing the effects of COVID and hearing about it out of Wuhan, and there was a lot of chatter, a lot of concern, and a lot of proper reaction from our team in China, going, all right, this is going to be quite bad. So we had that very first phase where we looked at it almost before the rest of the world really saw it, and said, all right, this looks really bad for China, which is just such a key market for us. And so we started to prepare for that and started to shift resources and do all those sort of things to make sure we could support China. And then obviously it started to then take over around the world. So we had kind of this steady stream of new realities as we went through. And even, I mean, we've got a major presence in India. It's where probably a third of my team is, and it's one of our biggest markets globally. And they're obviously still getting massively hit by this, and they're starting to turn the corner. But a week or two ago, they're probably at rock bottom, and probably one of the heaviest hit countries in the world. So because we're so global and are in so many markets that were deeply affected by it, like China, US, Brazil, India, Italy, ones that just were absolutely, everyone was affected, but these were really, it was pretty significant. So we've just seen a steady, there has been no moment where we were looking at it going business as usual. It's always been, just an effort of going, all right, now we got to go focus on this. Now we have to focus on that. So I think we haven't yet hit we thought we had about 2 months ago, where we were getting into recovery, and then India really started to struggle. And so now we've been all hands on deck trying to figure out how do we support the business, support the people on that side. So it's been pretty tumultuous.
And then for markets like the US that are going into this reopening phase, what advice do you have for brands? How are you as a marketer looking at taking advantage of the reopening, and just any concerns at this stage?
Yeah, I think the way I had been pitching for money in the past was accurate. We turned off all the money, and the brand metrics, they started to decay. So we saw it starting to come down. Now we haven't yet. It's not totally coin operated, so there is a slow glide path down, but we did see that coming down. So I think, one of the lessons I learned is that that is accurate, and we actually are able to use the last 14 months almost as a model to be able to say, if you do move your money like this will happen to your metrics. So it's weird to say, but it's actually been somewhat educational as a marketer to be able to see that glide path down when you turn off the funding. So that's been, I'll say in a positive way, interesting. I think also I mentioned that we insourced a lot of our capabilities at the start of it. We'd already started that before, but we just kind of turbocharged it. And that's been a really interesting learning. I went into sort of pre-pandemic, my mindset was, we probably can't insource everything, but every marketing service, but we can probably insource most of them. And we can really, it wasn't as much about financial benefit. It was much more about just taking control of what we do ourselves. And so when we went into the pandemic, that mindset continued, and I was going, all right, this is never waste a crisis. So this is the moment where we really accelerate on the insourcing. And we did. And what I found was, I think I think we swung the pendulum too far, probably. I think that or in my mind, I was swinging it too far. I think this idea that you can insource close to everything is way off. I think that not having access to the agencies that we used, even while we were insourcing, not having access to the media companies, or not being able to use them because we're not spending, not having access to some of the other partners that we use, particularly production companies around the world, really opened my eyes to the fact that it's not a whole hog thing that you go, all right, let's bring everything in-house. It's got to be much more nuanced than that. And so we're in the process right now, in the US at least, where a third of our team is based, and we've got a lot of our insourcing capabilities, of looking at how do we balance that out a bit? How do we make sure that the teams that we have in-house are really focused on exactly the right thing, but we start to balance that mindset out so it's no longer hell-bent on get everything in-house, but instead is much more balanced and really creating a set of criteria as to what we do ourselves and what we do externally. So in hindsight, as always, it's the obvious thing and much healthier, but it's very easy to get kind of addicted to that insourcing.
Yeah, and you bring up, with the reentry, getting together with marketing partners. How much of that do you think is going to be accelerating travel for the markets that are reopened, getting people together face to face? Do you see that as a slow ramp up? Do you see it happening sooner rather than later? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's going to be a spike. I think that there will be a massive spike in business travel coming soon out of the U.S. Or at least within the U.S. And then as soon as we're able to travel internationally, we will. And I think part of it is human nature. I think a lot of us have been very, very used to traveling and have been basically home for 14 months and are looking at it going, all right, going a little stir crazy. I want to go. I want to go out there and start meeting people, see my coworkers, do all that stuff. So I think there's going to be a real push around that. And I also just think that once you're able to, businesses will start to push, particularly on the sales side, for sales teams to go out and meet the customers. And so I think there'll be a natural spike. But I do think that once we're through that first, almost the human nature push of I just got to get on the road and I just got to get on a plane and go get out of my basement. I think it will come back down, and I think it'll come back down to levels below where we were before for two reasons. One, I think we've proven that we can do this sort of thing really effectively over Zoom. And even some of our toughest meetings, board meetings we have, the in-person executive committee meetings we have, where you would always have traveled to it, no matter where it was. We've done them all like this, so as has everyone. So I think we've proven that you're able to do it. So once we get through that burst of I got to travel, I think it'll be back to all right. Now I can balance work and life a little bit better. And I also think that companies must have seen such a massive savings in T&E over the past 14 months that I think it would be very difficult for the controllers and the finance community in large companies to open that spigot back up. So I think I think there'll be partly people realizing, oh, I can do this by Zoom, and partly a heightened restriction on your ability to travel.
And the travel question, Quinn, is interesting because it goes hand in hand with which markets are reopening, which ones are still struggling with COVID. You've got a very unique position where you've got a global view of the different markets for your business. I was wondering if you could just walk us through how you see each one of the regions of the world doing on the re-entry issue and how that plays into your thinking as a marketer.
Yeah, I mean, I've got the most direct view, obviously, of the U.S. because I'm sitting here, every day looking at it, and I think most of the people on the call have a pretty good sense of the U.S. I think when you go outside the U.S., China is, I guess what I'd say is fine and on alert. So they're traveling within the country. They're meeting in person, talking about my teams there. They're all in the office, they're traveling, they're on shoots, they're doing, it's sort of business as usual within China, but heavily on alert. Like they're very strict on quarantine of people coming in and regulations of people coming in, but even so, they occasionally get outbreaks, but are really good at, they're very, very savvy at how to contact trace and all of those things. So I think they're as close to back to normal as any market that I see. India is the exact opposite. Like I said, they are, my team there is sequestered in their homes. They're allowed out for 1 hour a day to go to the market at a pre-prescribed time. And basically they're prohibited from leaving their house, or at least that's the case it was last week. I don't know about this week. And hospitals are full to capacity. People are struggling to get oxygen. I mean, it's really, really terrible what's happening there. The death rate is really awful. So I think they are really struggling. Brazil, another big market for us, is struggling as well. You look at Europe, the UK has been on a bit of a roller coaster. I mean, they came out very strong, opened the pubs back up, declared hugging to be fine, which felt wonderfully British. And then I think are seeing a bit more of a spike now, and so are being very cautious. And then around the rest of Europe, actually, it's interesting. You get in a bubble here where I look at it, and a lot of the people, most of the people I know who want the vaccine have been vaccinated in the U.S. Or at least have a very near plan to be vaccinated. When I talk to senior execs in EMEA, in Europe, they are not. They're not able to get it, and so it just kind of reminds you that it is a different world. I mean, these are people with every means to be able to go and do it, and they can't get the vaccine. So I'm always cautious to not get too into the U.S. bubble, to realize that everyone is in and around the world, people are very mindful of the fact that everyone in every market is in a very different spot.
Yeah, and then when you think about how that plays into a marketer's perspective on what you're doing in certain markets, does that mean some initiatives are launching quicker, faster in other markets, and some you're still pulling back like everybody was 6-8 months ago?
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, take India for example, where we're pulling way back on what we were planning on doing in India from a marketing perspective. Partly because our teams aren't well, are sick, and need to spend time and focus on their families. Partly because the market is just incredibly, understandably distracted right now. So it's not a good time to be out there with a message. From a brand perspective, we're putting everything into kind of ESG, charity, like how do we help the people of India? And so it's really changed our marketing plans there. Other markets are being more opportunistic about it because their situation is a bit more stable. We do a lot in the healthcare industry. We do a lot around helping healthcare customers to be much smarter about their data, much smarter about treating patients, things like that. And so we're putting a lot of those messages out into market in those markets, just trying to be relevant, trying to be in touch with what people are talking about, and being part of the solution while still also marketing our products. We're also doing that. Some markets are going into their education buying season right now, and so we're very heavily going in there with a learn from home message instead of offering. So we're trying to be really sensitive to where it's really bad, and basically just treat those as a complete separate case where we do exactly what's right for the situation. And then in other markets where it's a bit more stable, just trying to be relevant to what, and we're not even distinguishing between kind of consumer commercial audience, just what humans are talking about and thinking about right now, which is generally education and healthcare. And so just trying to position ourselves in those spaces.
And that's interesting too, because I would imagine that as you're going through that planning on what you're going to do in each market, it goes a little bit back to your comment on in-housing and deciding what you take in-house and what you don't. I was really interested in sort of, we go back in time. What do you think are the main factors that causes a marketer to think, what in-house services should we have?
Yeah.
And you just lay out for us sort of the decision-making process. I think a lot of people would like to hear that.
Yeah, I think there's generally two. The most common one is cost, and it's cost pressure. People coming in saying, you're one of the biggest expense line. Marketing is one of the biggest expense line items on the P&L, and you need to cut back. And so generally, one lever you can pull to do that is to bring work in-house. So that's typically the main one. That's generally not a positive one. You're generally doing it under duress and not necessarily thinking about it logically. You're thinking about, all right, how do I cut the most expensive things and bring them in-house? And so that doesn't necessarily always lead to the best behavior. The other trigger, which is the one we were under, which is more interesting almost, is when you realize that you actually understand your brand better than anyone outside of the firewall can. And that comes over time as you work with really good agencies, really smart strategists, account people, creative people, the best in the business, and realize that they don't really get your company and your brand. And they can't. I mean, they don't live it every day. They're not, like I said, behind the firewall. They don't have the badge. They don't get the benefit of people opening up to them. They don't have a beer with coworkers after work. Like they don't have all of that really gets both the content, but more importantly, the tone and the voice of the brand really right. So we hit a point where we felt like we were doing good work with our agencies, but we always would look at it and go, it's not quite right. It's not quite the voice. It's not quite, they're not really getting to where we need them to get to. And it was just that moment where we said, we think we might be able to do this better because we understand the DNA of the brand. And so that was the impetus for us bringing it in, was to say, all right, how do we own our own IP in this space? Like, how do we own the strategy? How do we own the creative so that it just comes from the heart and comes from the people who really live this? And how do we bring in particularly creatives, but strategists and planners and account people and creatives who are willing to work inside a corporate marketing group, because it's a very different dynamic than an agency, and kind of get what we're going to ask them to do, but bring that same level of creativity that we could get from the outside agencies. So it's been a process of, and really you just have to convince them this is not about saving money. This is not about, we're not going to just, I will never tell you to bang it out. I will never have you do a banner. Like, this is about tackling the thorniest creative problems we've got as a company. And we want the best people in the world to do it. And those people have to be in the company in order to really get it. And so that's kind of the premise of how we went at it. And I think that still holds true. Like that this idea of the people who know the company best should be the ones who tackle the thorniest issues, I think is true. And I think is the foundation for what we'll keep in-house. But as you know, and partly spurred by the pandemic and partly spurred by me, obsessing over it, we started to bring everything into that model. And it was just at a point where I think we went too far. We weren't doing the super tactical stuff, but we were starting to do just more of the day-to-day work. And you started to see the creatives getting disillusioned. You started to see the strategists getting frustrated. You just started to see the team go, we came here to tackle those really meaty challenges. And we're really focused on how do we get, social posts out onto owned media right now that get high engagement rates. And that's where we started to go, all right, maybe it's square peg round hole right now with the team we've got and what we're trying to do.
That's interesting because you mentioned sort of speed a little bit in there when you talked about posts. Any points of view on bringing services in-house? Does it truly make you move faster, or is it depending on the marketing service?
Yeah, no, it's massively faster. But I think the thing I learned is that if you set up speed as one of the reasons you're doing it, you terrify people who you're trying to bring into the company, because they look at it and go, all you're going to do is shorten our timelines. Like, you're just going to assume you're not happy with how fast your agency moves. So you're going to bring us in-house and you're going to just shorten all your timelines. And It's not that at all. The speed actually comes from the speed of the brief. You suddenly start to have, and this does not sound like a best practice, but it really works. You suddenly start to have the strategists and the senior creatives in the meeting with the product people, talking about the technology, talking about the roadmap, all of those things, and really starting to get it, so that when the creative brief actually comes in, everyone's aligned, everyone's got it. And then it's typically the first round of work that's right. And whereas when we work with an agency, it would be 2 or 3 rounds sometimes to get it right. So it's not that we're compressing the production timing or anything like that. It's just you get off the mark much quicker, and you get sort of from 0 to 1 in that first concept much quicker, just because people are indoctrinated in it and know it.
And then, do you think you have certain marketing or agency services that should not come in-house, that are definitely better suited for a large scale advertising agency, for example?
Yes. I don't know about a large scale ad agency. I'm still struggling a bit with that one, but I will say that I've always thought that media should sit externally. So planning and buying, for the most part, should sit externally. We're starting to have discussions around insourcing on some of the digital fronts, but I don't have a lot of expertise in that. And so I think just personally, that's one I'm not that comfortable bringing in. I also think that some of the much more specialized skills like research and analytics, SEO, a lot of things in the digital and social space where it's, you really have to have deep and relevant and always evolving knowledge of what's happening in social, what's happening in digital, isn't the right thing for what we've got, which is essentially a fixed group of people who sit there and just think about the company, our challenges, and how to address them creatively. That team is not going to be up to speed on, how the Google algorithm's changing, and therefore how you do your search differently. So we need outside experts who always stay on top of that sort of thing. I'll give you an example. Like, we focus a lot on earnings, and which is not a high investment area for us, but thinking about how do we put forward the brand on an earnings call, in in the materials that we develop, in the road shows, in the analyst meetings, all of those sort of things, is super critical to how the company's perceived, how the company's valued, to the stock price, reputation, things like that. But that's not something I could ever imagine bringing an agency in to do and having them just inherently get how to do it. So I look at it and go, I'm now really willing to have conversations with agencies about specialized services. I'm also, I should say, really open to scaling services. So adaptation production companies, we work with a great one who is just brilliant at taking a master asset and just evolving it, not just resizing it, but actually taking it, transcreating it, evolving it for different media, different markets around the world. And so I look at that and go, I would never want, I'd considered it for a while, but I'd never now want to try to build that in-house. So I'm pretty committed to keeping that core capability that really goes after those super strategic, thorny, meaty brand challenges. But a lot of the rest of it, I'd look at and go, all right, let's go find exactly the right partner to do that, which is 180 degrees from where I was 14 months ago.
And then you mentioned talent, talking to talent, bring them in, Quinn. Any challenges there, or was that actually sort of I'll call it a labor of love, that you actually went to the market, found people you want to bring in the company and take on this work?
It was hard. I mean, we looked, in order to build out our core creative team, we probably looked for a year and a half, and that was to add 9 people. And so it was really about just having a very clear, candid conversation about what we were looking for, and kind of that the quid pro quo, almost the fact that if I'm talking to a creative, you're going to come in and you're going to work on one brand. You're going to work on Lenovo. We've got product brands, but essentially you're going to think about one thing the whole time. And so very different from an agency world where you get opportunities on multiple brands, multiple clients. So that's the downside in a sense. The upside is you're going to work on things that truly, truly challenge you strategically and creatively, that are just, you can't even, this is not an ad campaign. This is not this is not what you typically get. If we're pulling people from a traditional agency, this is not what the traditional agency has you doing for clients. It's a very different brief. So it's a very different brief, which will stimulate you pretty significantly intellectually and creatively. But it's going to be for the same thing. It's going to be going up against the same brand over time. So we obviously had much more detailed conversations about roles and responsibilities and what day-to-day life is like. And there's also it's a very different lifestyle on the client side than it is on the agency side, and very different modes of compensation. Like there's all different facets to it that when you're having these conversations, you can be pretty open. And I was really careful, and our creative director globally, I know, was really careful as we went out to talk to these people who we wanted to bring in, to not sell them on it at all, to not go, it's going to be amazing. Like this is going to be significantly better than what you're doing right now. We went at it as this is going to be really different than what you're doing right now. Here's the pros, here's the cons, here's how here's the opportunity. And we had a lot of those conversations, and we really wanted to find someone who took the time, and a group of people who took the time to genuinely make sure that that was right for them. And oh, by the way, you got to move to Raleigh, North Carolina. So that's a whole other factor for people. So it took us a long time to find the right group of people, and we did. I mean, we've got a really, really strong core, but we didn't want to bring in sort of the hottest creative who's rising up in the ranks at the top agency and throw a bunch of money at them and convince them that this is going to build their book and be the best thing ever. And, and then have them get here and go, hang on a second, this isn't at all what I thought. And I think we did that. I think we were so open and so clear and took the time that I think we now, when times get really tough, which they do, and they have, particularly over the last 14 months, the creative teams look at it and go, yes, I mean, this is exactly what I signed up for. And at times, like as we were starting to go, get way over our skis on this insourcing and start to do projects that we shouldn't be doing, they were really quick to go, hey, this is not what I signed up for. Like you said, this was going to be the meatiest, most interesting challenges of the company. And you said I wouldn't be doing banners, and I've got a brief for 15 banners right there. So those are the sort of things where we felt like we could have those open conversations and then steer us back on track to where we need to be.
And I'm curious, did that lead you to sourcing talent at agencies, or because of what you just said, maybe people that were already working on the client side, where it was an easier transition and understanding of the
thing? No, we actually, we were open to both, and we ended up with only people from agencies. So I don't know why. I don't know if there's a reason for that or if that's just how it worked out, but we went into it open to both.
That's interesting. Look, we have some good Q&A here, but before I get to that, want to ask you a question to put on sort of your thinking hat for the next 5 years from a brand perspective. What do you think the major marketers like yourself are going to be talking about and challenged with 5 years from now that maybe is not quite on the radar today? Or do you feel today's challenges are going to grow over the next 5 years and we'll still be talking about them?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I mean, the question terrifies me because and that's probably the answer, which is I think that I've become so used in the last 12, 14 months to looking pretty close at the ground in front of me and really about like, all right, where's the pandemic going? What's happening? How's our business doing? Where do we need to shift? We've become very agile, very flexible, but if I'm being honest, we've also become very short term. So I think I've become very much about like, all right, how do I get through the month? Or not me personally, but like, how do we get through the month and make sure we're delivering on our targets? And then, how do we look at the quarter coming up, and maybe how do we look at the end of the year? But it's really been head down, look at the ground right in front of you. So I think, the concept of a 5-year plan, the concept of a 3-year plan right now is somewhat daunting. I think, so I think the biggest challenge, I'll just speak for myself, the biggest challenge for me will be getting the view back up and going, all right, I have to look 3 years out. And that's one of the things I mentioned at the start that we did, which was really valuable, is we started looking heavily at reputation as a measure. And reputation is one of those few brand metrics that aren't coin operated. So it's, it's driven by so much more than marketing, and it's quite long-term in how it goes. And it's really, we work with a partner who is really nuanced and thoughtful about reputation, and really good at helping bring us along in terms of thinking about all the key drivers of it. And the only reason I'm mentioning this is I think that the answer probably lies there. Like we're going to continue to focus on the short-term business, the short-term, strategies and tactics that'll drive that business. But I think allocating a portion of our focus to that reputation. And one of the things we found was that one of the biggest builders of Lenovo reputation is as people see that we are deeply committed to diversity, which is unexpected, probably from a large global tech company like us. And genuinely committed to it in ways that most of our peers aren't. And so when you start to, when people learn that, there's an irrational increase in their regard for us as a brand, and that sticks around. And so I'd look at it and go, we got to continue to sell everything that we sell, but we've also got to figure out how to leverage that to start to drive really long-term and do both. And when we go into, argue for budgets, we go in for the short to midterm budget, and then we take a portion of it and also go in for the reputation building long-term budget.
Thank you for that. It's interesting as we're getting into the Q&A questions. Some of these questions talked about what you just mentioned. So there's a question here about when you're going through the crisis and you're focused on the short term, the long-term perspective, to get back at that. You mentioned some measurement aspects to it. Can you talk more about short-term measurement versus long-term measurement of the business and things you've learned over the last year?
Yeah. We've really divided our focus into 3. There's the super short-term stuff, which is like the media metrics that show just, if you put $1 into market, how's it doing? And how do you optimize it and get more value from it? So, clicks, impressions, engagement, that sort of stuff. And we've got tons of that and groups of people who analyze that. We've got kind of the midterm metrics that are also those coin operated ones that are generally the funnel metrics, like awareness, consideration, preference, share of search, those sort of things, that again are interesting to look at, but aren't necessarily, they're more a sign of how much you're spending than necessarily your brand strength and health overall. And then there's 3 that we look at that are really long-term. One is reputation. That's really, like I said, quite involved in how you look at it. But just overall, we've got a score for our reputation versus our competitors. We've got an industry average, and we measure ourselves over the long term as to how we're doing there. We look at purchase intent. So in general, if someone sees the brand, are they more likely to buy the products? And then premium, like when they decide to buy the products, are they more likely to spend more than they reasonably should on it? So we've got, I think, like we were talking about, keeping a focus on those long-term metrics and not just saying, hey, we're going to develop a long-term plan that's super strategic and pie in the sky, but actually saying, here's our reputation measure, here's our purchase intent and premium measures today. In 5 years, we want them to be this. And maybe not us specifically, but maybe pegged to the industry average, growing 2 times faster than the industry average, or something like that. That's a good measure. If you've got that sort of measure in place, so it feels like you're accountable to what you're doing and you can quantify it, then taking a portion of the money you get and allocating it against that sort of long-term measure becomes much more digestible for the company, for the finance teams who are allocating the money, because you're held to it and you can do it. But it also helps you structure your programs in a way because you actually have a real kind of quantifiable target for the long term.
This was great, guys. I'm sorry, I'm back. I don't want to cut you off. It's my least favorite part of this gig is interrupting these conversations, but super insightful. Quinn, I'm particularly, I've been fascinated by, in-housing, talent recruitment and, the brand agency dynamic when you think about, the types of personalities or skill sets that brands traditionally attract versus what agencies traditionally attract. And we've had different discussions with our community about it, historically. And, when you think about, a brand has to be the same brand today as it is tomorrow, as it was yesterday. So consistency is key, right? So, you build that in, whereas the agencies often think, lots of different, right? Like, they're thinking about variety, what's new, what's next. So in some ways, those are at odds, from a personality standpoint or skill set standpoint, so figuring out, do you want to build an in-house agency in some areas? Do you want to rely on those external perspectives? What does that dynamic look like? I don't know. I find it fascinating, and equally so that you've recruited all from the agency side, to come in-house, I think is awesome. So anyway, that's just my personal take on this all, but this was great. Love hearing from you guys. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll have you back again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, David. Thanks, Scott.
All right. Thank you so much, Quinn. Thank you, Scott. That was wonderful. We are going to keep the show going. We have 3 more great sessions. So right now we pre-recorded an interview between Rob Master, the Vice President of Media and Digital Engagement at Unilever, and Jed Dedrick, the Senior Vice